Thank you. You want to start over again? Okay. I got to practice in then. Good afternoon and welcome to the September special meeting of the Citizens Finance Advisory Committee. And welcome to our newest member, Sarah Love. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Chair Peck,
Here.
Member Johnson,
Here.
Member Love.
Here.
Quorum is established with Member Dorfman and Vice Chair Woody absent.
Thank you. At this time, we have an opportunity for public comment. Members of the audience wishing to address the CFAC on any city business matters not on the agenda may do so at this time. Also, if you have comments on the agendized item, you may also address the CFAC at this time. Seeing no one in the audience, AGP, is there anybody online?
Hello. There are no attendees with the raised hands.
Thank you. Moving on to the agendized item. Earlier this year, during a meeting of the City Council, we identified a need for the CFAC to investigate opportunities to grow city revenues in order to maintain services and fund infrastructure. Councilmember Edwards, our council liaison, can't be here today, but wanted to remind us that the city has adopted city goals and objectives along this line, specifically to complete the capital needs and financing assessments, completing the impact fee study, expediting development on city-owned properties, and following up on paid parking. The purpose of the task force is to investigate new revenue opportunities, and we have two objectives today as identified in the staff recommendation. Number one, to establish the purposes, parameters, and timeline for the study, and two, to appoint two members to the task force. Finance Director Conrad, do you have any additional background comments or information?
Thank you, Chair Peck. Yes, I would like to remind this committee that while preparing the forecast for this year and in the last few prior years, Finance became aware that, as past studies had also indicated, we're looking at closing of the gap between earned revenues and expected expenditures. In fact, looking at fiscal year 2027, we're anticipated to have expenses exceed revenues and not meet our required reserve of 33% of budget expenses in that fund, in our general fund. So it's looking critical that we find a way to increase revenues, the alternative being to decrease expenditures, which is difficult to do in a city when we have mostly personnel costs as our largest expenditure.
Thank you. So the first purpose today is to identify the scope and the content of the study. I circulated some initial thoughts on this matter, and I think they've been presented to you at the dais. So first of all, I wanted to see how the committee wanted to proceed on the first matter, establishing the purpose and the scope of the study. We can go through the suggestion that I made, or we can do it any other way you please, but the first task is to decide what we're going to do, probably the detail of the study after that, and then the timing of the study. Any preferences, committee?
Yeah, why don't we just go through the memo that you prepared and then add some thoughts?
Okay. The first part of the memo identified the scope of why we're doing what we're doing. There's a reference to a management partner study that was done in 2018, and there was a 2008, followed up in 2015, which led to the initial Measure Q for public services and public safety services, the expansion of the transient occupancy taxes, and then in 2020, the addition of Measure E. That has moved the city into a better position than most cities in San Luis Obispo County, but as Finance Director Conrad has indicated, we still have some ways to go before we actually come up with what appears to be a sustainable plan. The first suggestion I had is that our work program probably should focus on things that have already been studied or looked at and see how we can move those things forward. One of those is paid parking. That's part of the city's goals and objectives. The city completed a feasibility study 2 or 3 years ago, which demonstrated some additional money that could be provided for parking improvements, circulation improvements, things that are being funded either out of the harbor or the general fund now. I commented that Pismo Beach and Avila Beach get significant revenue from this source, and that this should be reviewed. The second item was added sales tax, either in the form of increasing our sales activity or an additional measure levy. There was a proposal this year to put for SLOCOG to put an item on the ballot for road purposes, and at that time the city considered whether or not it wanted to put its own additional measure on the ballot for that. That should receive some discussion. I'm also aware that the state legislature may be looking at raising the cap on the measure that could be addressed locally, and we should be looking at that. Several years ago, there was a parcel tax that was proposed for harbor infrastructure. It didn't pass, but the intelligence was that perhaps the application of the revenues would be too narrow. Perhaps if it included streets as well as harbor infrastructure, it may have provided more popular support. So maybe a deep dive or a postmortem on that would be helpful to determine if that would be a feasible source of additional revenue. Staff is looking at a reserve requirement to determine whether we need to keep as much money in the bank for the rainy day as they are now. The commentary that we've heard from in this meeting and this group is that a high reserve requirement simply means you're putting more of every new dollar into the bank and not committing it to services and infrastructure. The city's goals and objectives speak to the city property sales and development. That might include Market Plaza, which is the parking lot along the Embarcadero, as well as other city properties along the Embarcadero. Also, general property development. Since the adoption of the city's general plan and local coastal plan, we have a significant amount of underdeveloped or redevelopable property, and we probably have no specific actionable plan on that. That would include the Vistra property, the wastewater treatment plant property, the properties along Atascadero Road, and even the Morrow Elementary School site. In order to capture any opportunities for those, we probably should know what we want there and what to expect, how the infrastructure is going to be financed to support that, and what the financial outcomes will be for the city's coffers, including TOT and sales taxes, and possibly lease revenues on city-owned property. There are 2 new items that have been discussed in the past. One's called an enhanced infrastructure financing district, or community facilities district, and those would be special tax levies or special tax sharing that would be placed on large pieces of property. Other cities have done this. It's certainly worth looking into. So I'll stop there and see whether those are items that the rest of the committee would like to look into, or whether there are additional things that perhaps need to be looked into over the term of the study.
Okay, one thing that I know that Brian would bring up if he were here is the whole issue on, and I don't know if it's contained in anything you discussed, about ways to enhance the visibility of the city for example, for whether ecotourism or athletic tourism, or kind of enhancing the demographic appeal, and to bring, because we notice how we have relatively smaller revenues relative to Pismo and slower growth. And the county as a whole is a very hot area in terms of popularity. So it's sort of Morro Bay seems to not be quite getting in on on that trend. So, and then the second thing is I noticed just doing a very brief Google search that there have been a few economic development studies just in the last decade. And it was in 2014, there was a LEAP study. There was another study in, I think, 2017. So also, I love to just sort of, not reinvent the entire wheel and go through and maybe talk to some of the principals involved in those works to see if they had any things to include in our assessment.
So something along the lines of marketing and promotions is what you're speaking of?
Yeah, it's sort of more, again, more targeted or different targeting or whatever. Just to, I think last meeting, Brian was talking about how he had seen the effectiveness up in Monterey County for what they did for their otter visibility, and they don't have anywhere near the accessibility we do. So things like that build on existing strengths.
Okay. Sarah?
Yeah, I would totally agree with Eugene. Just the ecotourism piece, I think, could be a huge revenue source. Just looking at, like, I don't know, connecting it to potential development that the city could be a part of. And then just like a point of clarification, because I'm obviously very new to this, Stephen, these are kind of notes, these options are kind of your notes around like what the scope for the subcommittee would be. Is that right? Okay. And do we have to decide on that scope fully today, or can it be flexible?
I think the recommendation by the staff, and would be my recommendation too, is that we identify the topics that are going to need to be discussed. And this is something we're not going to get done until probably the middle of next year. But the items that are set out that we just discussed, those are all items that have been on the table. And maybe it's time to decide whether they need to be pushed off the table or moved forward. Some of them are just kind of languishing, and they're either good opportunities and they're not so good opportunities. Mm-hmm. So the idea would be, let's decide what the scope of the work is today, what the timing would be, how we're going to attack this, because the subcommittee as a committee of two mm-hmm. won't be able to make any decisions. Their job is to go away and collect data and come back with something that we can act on over the next 6 or 7 or 8 months. So I would suggest that we try not to evaluate these and eliminate some of them unless they're just, the committee thinks that they don't want to pursue it at all. I think these are things we look at, we affirm whether we want to recommend them or simply provide pros and cons. But it's the idea is to provide a broad scope so that we're not simply prejudging things that might be of benefit. And again, I think in order to be valuable to the city staff, we need to make sure they're specific, we quantify what the benefit is to the extent that we can, and that they're actionable. So our recommendation to staff and council will be, you should implement a parcel tax, and it should cover these items, if that's our recommendation. Mm-hmm. I suggest we avoid words like investigate, research, follow up.
So we want to be clear in our recommendation.
Yeah. I think there's enough of that in our public discourse right now. So, provide staff and council an easy way to do it. So that there's a desire to add things to this scope, I think that's a good idea. Some of the things that I've recommended here are simply straight out of the city's goals and objectives. Mm-hmm. So I would suggest that any of those stay on the list. But certainly the recommendations by you and committee member Johnson about marketings and promotions and just emphasizing the assets so that maybe those assets have more sales tax dollars or TOT with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's helpful.
Okay. To staff, Emily, is there anything that isn't on this list that is just burning in the minds of staff or council that we should be looking at?
I wish I had that magic bullet theory, but no, I don't. One idea that came up was to look back at those studies that were already completed, like the 2008, 2015 that you discussed, and look at those recommendations, since those studies were already completed, going to Member Johnson's point of not recreating the wheel.
Yep.
Look back at those study results, see if anything has already been accomplished that we can bring attention to and check off the list. Is anything remaining that's still a viable option?
Okay.
I would include that.
Right. And on the marketing and promotions issue, Committee Member Johnson referred to the LEAP study, which is the Local Economic Action Plan, that I think was done maybe 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And that was followed up by the Economic Development Strategy Plan or specific plan, and I identified some catalyst sites like the Market Plaza on the Embarcadero that were supposed to not only be assets in and of themselves, but add a kind of a catalyzing effect to other properties on the Embarcadero. So
Right.
that would be a good one to start with, because they actually, in the management partner study and in that study, they actually brought in professional outside consultants. They kind of looked at our crystal ball and then told us what we needed to look at, but they're both at least 8 or 10 years old, and the world's kind of changed since then, so that'd be a good recommendation too.
Yeah, I think that's timely, especially since I do believe there's a lot of discussion around the market property sale, and it can be sold just as it is, or ideally be sold with a vision behind it. Because the location is absolutely core. It's just kind of the theme is kind of missing. You know, that fishing town theme is wonderful, but it's not as accurate as it used to be.
Any thoughts on that one, Sarah, before we move on to that?
Well, I can just share, like, anecdotally, you know, my fiance and I moved to Morro Bay 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago. I was 25 at the time, almost 26. And I actually heard of Morro Bay first because of the Morro Bay Triathlon, which is different from the Ironman, which I know has been subject to other conversation lately. But I had signed up for the triathlon, and then we were looking for where we wanted to move around the Central Coast, and I was like, let's check out Morro Bay. And I think, yeah, just going back to the ecotourism piece, like a way to market the city that, like, focuses on the diversity of our environment here is really needed.
Okay.
Whether that's, you know, the wildlife or like the human aspect of like recreation and, you know, getting out in it, and yeah.
We have diverse human wildlife also.
Very diverse.
Your words, not mine.
So if we added item G under this, that was sort of marketing and promotions or economic development, that would include a review of the,
Oh, perfect. We've got
well,
the
it's
man
about
who's,
time.
I think he might have some thoughts on that.
For the record, Committee Member Dorfman is joining us at 3:21. So if we added a marketing and promotions category, that would include review of the local economic action plan, economic development specific plan, look at major events and major events, and then sort of a more coordinated, outward-looking promotions, maybe in coordination with TBID, the Chamber, and other organizations. Does that sound like it sort of covered?
Yeah,
the-
that does.
Okay.
Reflecting some of your viewpoints.
Brian, we were just covering the, I think the item that you spoke about last meeting, about being a little more effective and outward-looking on our selling our eco assets. And looking at that as part of the program we're looking at. We've sort of gone through the list of items that are in the goals and objectives for the city and some existing studies that are kind of pending right now, that would kind of be the scope of everything that we decide to do. We'd probably leave it up to you and Jean to, how you basically eat that elephant one bite at a time. But that would sort of wrap up the work program, I guess the topics that we would want, some decisions on. The second item I had were new revenue opportunities. These are basically additional new taxing opportunities. One is the Enhanced Infrastructure Financing District. That's a state provision for having the city take a larger share of additional taxes, tax increment financing. So if you had a major development project, maybe like Market Plaza, or something that might happen on the Vistra site, that the city would get more than its current share of property taxes in exchange for the cost to fund the infrastructure that's necessary for doing that. Kind of the old redevelopment tax increment financing approach. It does require other taxing agencies to give up some of their taxes, but the idea is in the long run, by having everybody sort of collect their money and put it into supporting development, that everybody's boat floats a little higher. I know we talked about this from the chamber standpoint with the previous city management and with the scope of the development opportunities that are out there, possibly even the Morrill Elementary School site, which is a zero tax basis because it's publicly owned. That might be an important opportunity for generating some infrastructure financing. The other one is the Community Facilities District, which is simply an additional tax to fund infrastructure, and the owner of the property would have to agree to that to finance additional infrastructure. But what we're experiencing on the Embarcadero and the Vistra site and the wastewater treatment site right next door is a optimal way of putting a special tax there to fund public facilities that would stay on the property for a long time, if not in perpetuity. These are very common in San Luis Obispo that could be considered. And both of these would be tax strategies that would apply to special development properties, not generally to everybody, so it would be a tax increase for the general population. So if those are things that we want to look at, we can do that if the committee wants.
I have a question on that first, Enhanced Infrastructure District. Does that mean reallocating taxes that would go to the county and then giving them to?
Yeah, the provisions of that is that it would be a remix of the taxes split between everybody but the school districts. The school districts would get the money that they would get. They can't sacrifice it. But the county and the city and other special districts would have to voluntarily decide that they were going to skew more of that money to the city so the city could provide the infrastructure to generate more development that would happen anyway. So,
Is there a history of that being agreed on in SLO County?
no, not yet. It's happened a lot of other places, and it's a follow-up to what used to be done in redevelopment, where the city would establish a redevelopment district, and then all the property taxes that would generate above a base level would be skewed more towards the city so it could tear down buildings that were blighted or dilapidated, put in infrastructure. But it would have to be perceived by all the taxing entities as a win-win. They wouldn't voluntarily give that up if they didn't think they were going to.
Right, they'd get more revenue just because of the pie growing.
Right.
Okay, yeah.
Sarah?
I'll figure out how to work this microphone eventually. I had a question about a different item on here, if that's okay. Just going back to option D, the reserve requirement. I was just wondering, I know Director Conrad. You gave some notes initially about the city having a, 33% is the reserve? Is that like the standard, or?
I think we determined it was a little bit higher than average, 25%. I mean, Melissa did a lot of work on this next to me, which is why she's nodding along and will
Sure.
correct me if I'm wrong. I think 25% turned out to be more on par with what other agencies have going.
Okay,
And we have, as a goal for our department this fiscal year, to complete a risk-based reserve approach. We have not done that yet, but it's early yet.
that sounds like a big undertaking, yeah.
Is it still the case? Is it still the case that the city has an objective of having a 50% requirement, but a 33% minimum? That was established about 3 or 4 years ago, wasn't it? And is that still the case?
That's still the current policy.
Okay,
Yes.
great.
It's worded as 33% minimum, 50% target.
Okay. And that's compared to the 25% we had going into COVID and, okay, I guess the answer to the question is, I think they're working on that, but it's also on the council's list of things to do. So it's going to end up in our lap anyway, probably for a recommendation, so thought we'd get ahead of it.
Thank you, I was just curious.
Brian, any questions? I'm just going to catch up here. Okay. The third item was sort of how we're going to go about addressing these. Certainly, the task force would need to cooperate regularly with city staff, and the suggestion was that there probably should be an initial meeting about all these items and how they could best be coordinated with the city staff, including the city manager. What we don't want is sort of go off all on our own and find out that either the city's already doing the study, they've already made a decision, or they have this key piece of information that we always wanted. So wanted to be that sort of a cooperative relationship. And then maybe ongoing meetings with designated city staff, including the CD director for the development-related issues, public works director, and the finance director. And then the task force responsibility would be to report back to us regularly at our regular meetings, identifying any decision points or findings, issues that need to be resolved, maybe just some discussion about moving forward on a particular issue. And then completing the task sometime at the end of this fiscal year in June. So we have meetings in October, January, February, and May, and then maybe a special meeting in June just to kind of wrap this up so we don't roll it over to the next fiscal year. So one of the purposes of the task force would simply be to sort of look at this and figure out how it needs to be broken down, take the hard stuff first, easy stuff first. Maybe that's a discussion with city staff, Emily, that how can we sort of do this? What's the best way of doing this and cooperating with staff while not creating a whole new work program for them? So we know that you have all the answers and that all we need to do is sort of draw them out of you.
We could certainly meet and keep in touch on a monthly basis. I can't commit the other directors to that, but I can commit to that. And I really like the word collaboration. I definitely enjoy a team approach to these issues. I still don't have a magic answer for how we're going to do all of this, but happy to dig into it.
Well, as the government says, we're here to help, right?
Exactly.
And that's what we are. We're here to help. Does the schedule and the process feel okay?
Yeah, I think that's quite a reasonable one. I think it's important to have structure and just set the timelines to get it done.
Yeah. And the final recommendation is that, and I mentioned this at the top, that we be specific, quantified, and actionable. We don't want to waste staff's time or our time with something that says somebody else needs to review this further. Let's be specific about what we mean. Let's say, does it work or not? Is it worth the effort to do it? And I'd encourage us to kind of not ignore, but kind of look past what the political and popular objections may be. I think that's part of what we would need to eventually do is have opportunity for public comment, because part of, I think, what we need to do is sort of sort through what any popular or community objections might be, and then to modify our recommendations in that regard. So I anticipate sometimes toward the end of the process, we would have something that people could comment on, and then we would take that into consideration before we made a recommendation. I don't expect that's going to happen until second quarter or late in the first quarter.
One comment I have, I think it's important, I recall that you mentioned 33% shortage by 2027. What is that dollar amount? So we can kind of look at targets in terms of the financial goals that need to be met and the individual contributions of all those items that we're discussing. Because that way, it's a good way to triage just looking at the big ticket items and prioritizing those.
So the forecast is available in the published budget, just so you know, you don't have to memorize what I'm about to say. So if you're referring to the fiscal year 2027 ending balance?
That 33% short gap.
So 33% is the minimum. So we're projecting based on what we currently know about revenues, what we currently know about expenditures. We're projecting about 24% by the end of fiscal year 2027.
But just the dollar amount. Okay.
$2.3 million.
Okay. That's.
Did you have more parts of that question? That covered it? Okay.
Yeah.
And so as we sort of think about things that are specific, quantifiable, and actionable, obviously, city staff has a $2.5 million problem in front of them. So things that can be done quickly that start to nibble away at that are probably high priorities. Those that, have longer leads on them are probably going to be, those need to be identified as sort of short-term and long-term.
You're saying currently they have a $2.5 million problem?
The projection is by 2027, there's a $2.5 million shortfall. Yeah. Yeah. And I guess the learning to take away also is that this isn't a surprise. We've known about this. We've been told it since I started sitting on the CFAC. The 2008 and 2015 management partner study said, you got a problem. And they started dealing with it, and we got caught up, as the table that I provided showed, is that we're not as bad off as some of the cities in the county, but we still have significant needs. So time to kind of see what we need to do next and be unambiguous about the fact that it needs to be done now. What is that? So with that discussion, is there a motion?
We would be looking for a motion to appoint members to the subcommittee.
Do we need to provide the scope of you got a two-part recommendation. One is to identify the scope, and the second one is to appoint the committee. So can we take those with two motions?
Yes, we can.
Okay,
We would want to define the purpose, the parameters, and duration.
okay.
Yes.
I make a motion that we identify a scope, the items identified by Chair Peck, with the addition of the marketing and promotion component.
And the, before we do that, is there a second to the motion?
I'll second the motion.
Discussion? Do we also need to identify the schedule and the process as identified in number 3?
I think that having the target of by June 2025 is, with those periodic updates at the interim meetings is a good
Okay,
framework.
okay. You
So
vote?
include that time frame work within the scope of the project.
And you're good on the second to that revised motion? Yes. Okay. Do we need to call the roll or just a voice vote? All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. The second item on the agenda is figuring out who's going to do all this work. Brian and Jean have volunteered in the past, although you're going to get plenty of help from the rest of us. You two still good to serve on the task force?
Yes.
Brian?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, all right. Just for the record, I'm sorry I showed up late. I have a drive from the Bay Area, so it's just how it went down. Yeah, I think we have very complementary skills, so I like working with Jean a lot, and I'm excited to get it. We're very organized, and so I think that's helpful, and also, like the rest of you, certainly don't want to waste your time. There's definitely, questions and information that would help. I mean, I'm looking forward to understanding more where the current situation is, so hopefully that's not a burdensome on anybody, and I think you have a lot of parameters out there, so, yeah.
So with that all, I will nominate Committee Member Johnson and Dorfman to the task force. Is there a second? Second. Voice vote, all those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
I as in literally I.
I think that concludes our business today. Emily, anything for the good of the order? Our next meeting? I won't be at the next meeting. I'll be floating down the Seine River.
Oh,
Michael's bringing cookies next time.
that's right. Mike,
I'm sorry, anything for the good of the order?
Only that our next meeting is scheduled on October 15th, 2024.
Okay,
And we will miss your presence, Chair Peck,
yeah,
but wish you happy anniversary.
thank you. With that, motion to adjourn, do we have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn?
Second?
I second that.
All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Thank you.